Does having more information lead to more understanding or to less understanding? How do we learn the things we learn? And what's the best way to learn them? These are some of the questions we're going to look at in this video. And here's one other question. When did our civilization reach its peak? It can be tempting to think that because we know lots of things and have access to a huge amount of knowledge, that we are smarter and more knowledgeable than previous generations. It's worth asking ourselves, is this truly the case? The title of Robert Fulghum's famous book, All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten, gets to the heart of this question. As children, we learn things directly from our parents, our siblings, and our friends. Children learn hands-on, directly, intuitively, and eventually through the spoken word. Another way of putting this is that children have an oral culture. The things that children first learn prepare them for a lifetime of proper relationships with other people and with the world around them. Later on, children learn how to read and write, and their source of knowledge becomes increasingly typographic, that is, based in books. So this movement from hands-on knowledge to book-based knowledge is a movement from knowing things to knowing about things. Knowing about things can be important and useful, but it's good to remember that the more knowledge we acquire in this way, the more distanced we are from actual hands-on knowledge. So why does this matter? Among other things, it matters because how we learn things affects the value and the retention of the things we learn. If, for example, the goal is to remember that we will burn ourselves if we put our hand on a hot oven, are we more likely to remember this better by reading about it in a book or by actually burning our hand on a hot stove? Hopefully the latter is not necessary, but if one learns the lesson in this way, one is much more likely to remember than if one simply reads about it in a book. The more distance there is between knowledge and the physical world, the less real the knowledge becomes, and the less connected we are with the physical world and with the people around us. Today's video centers around epistemology, which is simply that area of philosophy that looks at how humans acquire knowledge. Chapter 2 of Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, has the title Media as Epistemology. And in it, Postman looks at the transition that has taken place in the past 100 years from the typographic age to the visual age. Because of the way it directs us to organize our minds and integrate our experience of the world, it, that is any given medium, imposes itself on our consciousness and social institutions in myriad forms. It sometimes has the power to become implicated in our concepts of piety or goodness or beauty, and it is always implicated in the ways we define and regulate our ideas of truth. So, a core idea that Postman returns to over and over again is that every new medium and every new technology has a great deal of unintended consequences that are usually unexpected, are often ignored, and usually proceed unchecked because the usefulness and attractiveness of the new medium or technology is so enchanting. The history of civilization is a history of the increasing abstraction of human thought and of an increasing distance from humans' innate powers. When man first appeared, he developed an oral culture, which of necessity limited the amount of knowledge that could be passed on, the limit being the collective memory of the people. It also provided a filter as to what knowledge could be passed on, for knowledge was personally transmitted. Each person transmitting the knowledge took responsibility for it, and it was communally transmitted. Only those things allowed by the community to be transmitted were passed on. The most famous occurrence of this filter can be seen in the trial of Socrates, who was convicted of supposedly corrupting the youth and his refusal to refrain from telling what he considered to be the truth. Written text was a step away from oral culture, and a great step towards the increasing abstraction of language, and therefore of human thinking, human culture, and of life. It was only with the advent of Gutenberg's printing press in the 15th century, however, that the weight was tilted nearly exclusively towards the written word and mass literacy. Literacy accelerated the movement towards individualism, the abstraction of knowledge, as well as greatly diminished the capacity for communities to filter knowledge. In the 21st century, we find ourselves living atomized lives, solely bearing the burden of not only finding and understanding knowledge, but of evaluating its veracity, its practical value, its moral quality, as well as situating it in a context in which it can have and generate meaning. And we are attempting this impossible task in a media environment that is completely tilted towards the visual world. Postman will get into what this shift means later on, but for now, suffice it to say that visual media is the most immediate and powerful in its ability to bypass the human mind and to trigger our most basic instincts. Increasingly, we live in a culture that reacts to stimuli on a visceral level, rather than rationally tries to understand it and to respond to it without emotion. Having left our oral culture far behind, we no longer have the social cohesion and assistance of the hive mind and hive intuition to help us process knowledge and to navigate the world. When we zoom out and look at epistemology in this way, we can see that humanity has gone through two main transitions, each of which has weakened humans' ability to process knowledge. Initially, in the age of orality, humans acquired knowledge both intuitively as well as communally. Knowledge was filtered by the community, and the intuition of each member of the community resonated with the accepted knowledge. Absent this common intuition, knowledge would not make it through the filter of the community. With the advent of the typographic age, any and all knowledge was allowed to flow into written texts that could be distributed independently of any given community. This was a boon for the advancement of science and knowledge, but it left the individual as the arbiter of truth. While human intuition was ultimately the arbiter of truth in the typographic age, communities could still find cohesion through the acceptance of a canon of agreed-upon books, and the fixed word provided an anchor for human thought and communication. With the advent of the visual age, however, human intuition is all that we have to discern the truth, meaning, etc., of any visual stimuli that we encounter. Truth used to be something that communities shared and guarded, and it is now a complete abstraction that is determined individually and in the moment. We must remember that Galileo merely said that the language of nature is written in mathematics. He did not say everything is, and even the truth about nature need not be expressed in mathematics. For most of human history, the language of nature has been the language of myth and ritual. A great deal of cultural criticism consists in discerning, pointing out, and critiquing the myths that we as moderns accept as inherently true. Our culture's obsession with numbers and quantification, to the exclusion of any other way of thinking about things, is one of our greatest blind spots. Because of our obsession with numbers and with the scientific approach to the world, it has become increasingly difficult for us to relate to and to engage with the natural world in a holistic way. Quote, "For most of human history, the language of nature has been the language of myth and ritual." The result of this deficiency in our relationship is that we have increasingly disconnected and extracted ourselves from nature. This disconnection has serious consequences for the ways in which we treat and abuse nature. Even more catastrophic are the ways in which we treat and abuse our own human nature. These forms, myth and ritual, one might add, had the virtues of leaving nature unthreatened and of encouraging the belief that human beings are part of it. It hardly befits a people who stand ready to blow up the planet to praise themselves too vigorously for having found the true way to talk about nature. They delude themselves who believe that television and print coexist, for coexistence implies parity. There is no parity here. So Postman wrote his book more than 40 years ago, and even then he was already noting that the visual medium, at that time mainly television, had already surpassed the written medium. The advent of the internet, and especially of social media, has only solidified this reality. I point this out because most people do not ask themselves the question, is our culture more affected by images or by written words? Am I more affected by one or the other? Because these changes happen slowly, ecologically, we don't notice them, and so we don't ask these kinds of questions. This is much more the case with younger generations who have never experienced a world where the image didn't reign supreme. So what does this mean for us? If we accept Postman's position that, quote, the epistemology created by television not only is inferior to a print-based epistemology, but is dangerous and absurdist, then we need to live our lives in ways that minimize image-based culture, especially as it relates to the upbringing of children. We would do well to surround ourselves by people who share our convictions, and to always remember that most of the culture around us does not literally think in the same way that we do. One of the reasons that our culture is in such a bad state is that logic and reasoned argumentation are no longer regarded as the right way to come to an agreed upon truth. Image-based culture creates people who believe that truth is based on how one feels, and that facts are therefore mostly irrelevant. Clearly, one can't have a fruitful conversation or debate with someone who does not share the foundation of traditional truth claims. Like the fish who survive a toxic river and the boatmen who sail on it, there still dwell among us those whose sense of things is largely influenced by older and clearer waters. Obviously, my point of view is that the 400-year imperial dominance of typography was a far greater benefit than deficit. Most of our modern ideas about the uses of the intellect were formed by the printed word, as were our ideas about education, knowledge, truth, and information. So if it hasn't already become clear, I love Neil Postman, and I greatly appreciate the critical perspective he provides in understanding the modern world. That said, at least for the time being, I remain somewhat agnostic as regards his enthusiasm for the age of typography. I certainly recognize the incredible material benefits that the mass-produced written word provided. That said, whether or not the, quote, dominance of typography was a far greater benefit than deficit is a topic that is definitely open to debate. One of the unintended and rarely appreciated consequences of the age of typography is that humanity lives under the constant shadow of nuclear annihilation. New technologies appear to have made modern people less content, not more content. And modern technologies such as AI provide additional causes for mass anxiety. One of the great causes that hides behind many of the modern world's ills is that as humans have discovered increasingly powerful tools that provide us leverage to create big results, we increasingly create things, spaces, concepts, ways of being that are not to human scale. A good example of this is the modern big box store, such as Walmart, Target, and so on. Yeah, we're able to get a lot of things inexpensively because of the leverage that bulk purchasing, etc., can provide. But we often forget to ask ourselves important questions like, do I really need all this stuff? And what kind of a community and culture does this kind of commerce create? And do I like it? As a human, does it serve me well? Is it human scale is a great question that one can ask to determine the relative value of a thing. I mention this because the age of typography enabled a world of increasingly powerful leverage to be created. The age of orality that preceded it was an age where nearly everything was human scale, and therefore human-centric. It's easy as moderns to dismiss the virtues of the age of orality, but I think we would be well served to try to both appreciate and to understand these virtues, as well as, to the extent possible, to adopt them in our own lives. Okay, so that is it for today. Next week's installment, we'll look at Chapter 3 of Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. As I mentioned previously, please join the conversation on Substack in particular, or elsewhere on social media. As always, if you haven't already, please subscribe, follow me on X and on other platforms. There are links below the video, and download the How Did We Get Here reading list. Finally, please let me know in the comments below what era of knowledge you think represents the apex of our civilization. Was it the age of orality, the typographic age, or the visual age? Thanks a lot. Have a great week, and I'll see you soon.